Hi, welcome to our ProAV Academy series on tech terms, where we sit down with Alister Chapman and chat through some of the technical terms that just come up again and again in this industry. Alister is one of the best people I know at explaining complex technical concepts, so hopefully, just by casually chatting with him each one of these terms through, these videos can just help clear up some of the confusion that might be out there on each of these terms. Today we're explaining what we mean when we refer to a camera's codec. So codec is always an interesting one, isn't it? Because everyone uses it, every single camera has different types of codecs in it, every camera will be using a codec, and yet it's often a huge thing between choosing between different cameras and different projects as well. What does codec actually mean? What are we talking about when we say codec?
Codec is short for coder decoder, and it's a way of taking a video signal or audio, but taking that signal and coding it in a way that your playback device can decode it. Now, generally, we tend to think of that as being compression. It's not necessarily compression, because codec doesn't have to be compressed, and there are many uncompressed codecs, decoders, but we generally tend to think about taking a file, putting it into a codec to make it smaller, to make it manageable, so we can record it on a relatively small card or media, and then we take it into post-production, we expand it so we can then edit it and work with it.
Certainly in the camera world, that's the most common.
Yeah, so and it's important to understand there's different requirements, of course, in camera to post-production. So in a camera, we're trying to record generally lots and lots of stuff on a very small card, so we want a codec that's very good at making the file small and compact. Then in post-production, storage is relatively cheap. We've got lots of it generally, and it's pretty fast these days. So what we actually want is something that can be decompressed, made bigger to be viewed quickly and easily, so that we can have a nice, smooth and pleasant editing experience. And sometimes the two aren't necessarily compatible. We can make files very, very small these days, but then they're harder to play back. And a good example of that is what we would call an an intra-frame codec, where we don't record all of the information of every single frame. So we start off by recording one frame in its entirety, and even that one is compressed using various methods. But then for the next 10, 12, 14, however many frames in what's called the group of pictures, the GOP, we only record the differences between that first frame and then what will be the next, in 14 frames time, full frame again. So we look forwards and we look backwards, and we say, well, what's different between this one? And we only record those differences. And that's very efficient, because all these middle frames contain very little data. But then when you come to play it back, as the computer pulls the files off the drive or whatever, it's got to pull that one off, and it's got to pull that one off, and then it's got to do all of the calculations as to what should be in the middle, and it's got to do all of that in real time, which is difficult. So some codecs, so XAVC-L from Sony is a long GOP codec, this one of these intra-frame codecs, and they're really difficult to work with sometimes in post-production compared to an iframe only codec, where every single frame is individually coded. Now, in terms of codec families, we tend to be working nowadays, most of the codecs currently used are based on one or other of the MPEG standards. So in the past with XDCAM, that used to be MPEG-2, which is an 8-bit codec. But nowadays, almost everything, whether it's Sony, Canon, Panasonic, whatever, seems to be based on H.264 and that technology. So XAVC is an H.264 type codec, and we're using that because it's much more efficient. Going forwards, we're moving in some areas to H.265 because it's even more efficient. But then we do run into these problems with H.265, these codecs, because they're more efficient, they are requiring more processing power to work with, and it's a double-edged sword there. It's like, yeah, well, sure, we can make the file smaller, but it might be a bit harder to work with in post. So there's all sorts of issues. And generally, any compressed codec is a compromise, because to make a file smaller, you've got to throw stuff away. You can't just make it smaller without giving something up. So there's always a fine balancing act being done by the camera manufacturers to come up with codecs that can make our files smaller without the artifacts that are inevitable being visible. I mean, that's the key. Artifacts are fine until you can see them, then they become a problem. So yeah, these codecs have got to be able to work in a way that we can't visually see it.
In terms of choosing between different codecs, I guess it comes down to the ideal situation is to shoot in a acquisition codec, which is very, very small and quite compressed, but retains a huge amount of quality, but would be difficult to play back in post-production. Then converting from that one to a post-production codec, which is a much larger file size, but plays back very easily. And I guess that's fine, you can absolutely do that, but sometimes you need to have one codec that goes all the way through production, particularly for quicker work.
Yeah, I mean a common workflow is to take your camera codec, convert it before you go into post-production to something easy to work with, and so on. And that is okay, that's fine, but you do need to understand that every time you convert a codec from one codec to another codec, there will be some loss. It's inevitable. So going from your camera codec to create new files to work with in post-production will incur an image quality penalty. Now, it might be absolutely tiny, very, very insignificant, but it's still there. So if you can work directly with the camera codec in post-production, that would always be my recommendation. And computers are getting more powerful now, and everything like that. So even some of the more difficult to work with codecs now, most computers can deal with. So really, you are best sticking with the camera original to start off with. Now, once you do your grading, your editing, your grading, and anything else, that file is going to require some additional processing. So at that point, that's when it's fine then to go to another codec to then output it. So a very common workflow would be to shoot on your camera codec, perhaps XAVC, do your edit and output as ProRes, because ProRes is a bigger, less lossy file, so you lose less in that final output. And that's a very good, very valid workflow. Using something in between, though, going from the camera codec to an intermediate codec to then edit that intermediate codec is less desirable from an image quality point of view, but may be necessary sometimes from a fluidity in post-production point of view of being able to work with the file more easily. So you have to decide, what do I need here? Do I want the ultimate in image quality if I stay with the original camera negative, or do I need to actually have something I can work with more easily? And only you can make that choice in your workflow. There's no, I can't tell you unless I know your workflow intimately what's going to be the best for you. So you need to think about that and consider that for yourself.
Thanks for watching, I hope that was helpful. Keep in mind, we also do a whole range of ProAV Academy workshops held right here in our UK showroom, where we cover a whole range of topics, from audio to post-production, camera techniques, business tips, lighting tips, and many more. The main aim of these workshops is to help our customers learn and develop their skills. And there's something about face-to-face training which can just never be replaced by videos like this one. So if you're in the UK, please do get a ticket from the link down below and join us for ProAV Academy.